Welcome back to Malaysia's ASEAN Moment, a limited series on the 2025 ASEAN Chairmanship diving into Malaysia's approach from a policy perspective. I'm your host, Angeline, and with us today is Tan Sri Dr. Rebecca Fatima Samaria. She is currently the director at the Institute of Democracy and Economic Affairs, and before this, she was also the executive director of the APEC Secretariat, and most notably, she's the former Secretary General of the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, where she acted as the chief negotiator for free trade agreements, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which now faces the CPTPP, and also the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. So today's episode is going to be about the ASEAN Economic Community, or the AEC, as sometimes we call it, which is ASEAN's vision for a more integrated regional economy, where goods, services, investment, capital, skilled labor, all the likes, can flow free, and where growth is inclusive across all member states. So this idea of the AEC has very, very early roots, and it took a while to come into fruition. So maybe as a startup question, Tan Sri, could you share a little bit about where the idea of the AEC came from and maybe how we got to today?
Okay. First of all, thank you for having me in this session. I think before we get to the AEC, we have to look a bit at the process and understand and appreciate the ASEAN way. Everything that we do in ASEAN is deliberate, is intentional. And if you look at the economic pillar, that's my forte. I'm very familiar with it. When I first joined service, and this was in 1981, one of my first assignments, I was attached to the Ministry of the Ministry of Trade and Industry in the International Division. And my first assignment was to be a rapporteur for the ASEAN Economic Ministers meeting. Okay, this was way before computers and the internet and Google, everything. So we was on the agenda. One of the main things on the agenda then was what we called the ASEAN Preferential Trade Agreement. No one envisaged a free trade area of ASEAN at all. And what we would do then was each member state would put on the table products that they would want to bring duties down. Okay, so it was very transactional. Each of us would put products in, and then that would be compiled into the preferential trade. And then as we progressed, the PTA kept building. We kept building on the PTA. That more and more products kept being included. And then there were a key milestone, a key point in history was the crisis. I think we had, I want to say it was tensions, the Cold War tensions, 1991, when we looked at ourselves and said, okay, we've done the PTA, it's now mature enough. Can we take that next step? So that's when we started work on the ASEAN Free Trade Area. Okay, so that's the after. So imagine in 1991, before it was fashionable for folks to talk of the trade agreement. So 1994, it was in place, the agreement was in place. If you look at the trajectory of ASEAN and how we move forward, like I said, it's a process, but there were key points in history that caused us to make some changes.
Right.
All right. So for example, the global financial crisis. All right. That was 2008, 2009. We said, okay. And that was the few things were happening at that time, 2008, 2009. You had work, the process of thinking through ASEAN. You had work going on the possibility of an ASEAN charter, the discussions around communities then, whether it was political, cultural, the cultural, social cultural pillar, the political security pillar, the economic pillar. There was a lot of discussion going on, and we were working, as it were, then very defined silos, each of us silos rather. And that's when the thinking process came, is it, can we look at us more holistically? It's time for ASEAN to take that next step. And I remember we were asked to review the different models. And I remember going to the EU and talking to the EU, part of the ASEAN delegation. As we were doing that, the process of getting the charter going was a parallel process. Earlier on, even as we were looking at ASEAN as a community, the work by the different silos, as I said, the different pillars, was carrying on. So we refined after we looked at what we committed in after, and we said, this is we're at a stage where we're ready to take it even further. So even when I say that the economic pillar was moving on, it wasn't just about the trade side. We looked at investment, we looked at services. There were different parts of the economic pillar, if you wish, going on, what was going on. So bringing it all together, how do you make sense of the different streams of work? As I'm talking about the economic pillar, for example, there's so many streams of work. There was work going on in the trade side, there was the investment side, the services side, movement of people. All these things were being discussed. The finance side, of course, yeah. So that sort of got ASEAN Economic Ministers and ASEAN Economic City officials thinking about how do we pull all this together. And that was the beginning of the community. Now, when you think about how do you do this, how do you bring all these things together, that was the start of the blueprints, right? And when, the economic pillar, like I said, very strong leadership, I must say, at that time. So when work was being done on the charter, we were given very clear instructions. Go find a way. We have to have solid inputs into this structure, into this ASEAN charter, at least from the economic side, because we are the ones that would help drive ASEAN integration in that sense. So we then began work in earnest on the economic blueprint 2015.
In tandem with the charter.
Yes, in tandem with the charter. And with also, when we have, every time there's a crisis, there's a situation, we tend to hasten our work. So we said, okay, we had Vision 2020 in the 90s. ASEAN had its own vision. We said, no. So for the economic pillar, I'm being very selfish here, just talking with the economic pillar, right? We said, no, it's 2020 is too far away. Let's bring it forward. Let's do 2015. And that's how the AEC 2015 came about, really. So we worked on it in earnest in 2006. So we were very prepared. The economic pillar was very prepared to have this launch when we launched the charter. So word got around that, hey, look, the economic pillar can't be the only ones with a blueprint.
Right. So then economic pillar led the initiative.
So the others that quickly got that together, and to be fair, everybody worked very hard to ensure that come 2007, when we announced the charter, the signing of the charter for implementation in 2008, all the blueprints were ready. So actually it was, I must give credit to the leadership then, to make us work at it, seriously work at it.
You mentioned that that there was a very intense target of 2015 ahead of 2020.
Yeah.
What was the rationale behind that?
One was, we were going through, we saw how things were developing globally. And really, as we were talking and looking at, seeing how everything was moving forward, we thought 2020 was just too long away. We wanted to make sure, as you are launching or having this big thing about the ASEAN Charter, can we be more proactive? So it was that. Yes, you have the Vision 2020, but we don't want to take too long to get there. Let's try and move it faster. So that was the rationale, was just hasten it. And there were things happening economically around the world that said, ASEAN, you shouldn't be taking a backseat. ASEAN should be moving in tandem or faster. Now, 2011 was another critical point for us. 2011 was when the message went out there, really, that the ASEAN members, partners, the dialogue partners were saying, can we do the ASEAN plus 3 FTAs? Consolidate ASEAN plus 3. ASEAN plus China plus Japan plus Korea. Very consolidated. And then you had another group which says, no, we've got 6, we have the other FTAs in place. As things were progressing, and what the ASEAN experienced at that time was, because the +1 FTAs were in place, so there was this always this need to move on, and having discussed with business, it's also saying, okay, you've got your FTAs, but each FTA has its own set of rules, right? Rules of origin. So for businesses, small businesses, more so. Big businesses, you can set up a whole division administratively to manage the FTAs, depending on where you're exporting to, right? You're trading with. So there was this push among some of them, Japan, Korea, some of them to say, let's do an ASEAN Plus group. Then there were another group, let's do an ASEAN Plus 6. Okay, so this conversation was going on, and there were studies being done. And for me, you can do studies upon studies upon studies, but you need to get to a stage where you make a decision. So I remember in 2008 or so, we were sitting around in Bali with Hariman guest who was then trade minister, talking about it. And we were contemplating what to do with this tension that we're having. Plus 3 plus 8. So we all sat and we said, okay, let's analyze this. What do we want? What would work for the region? Forget all the individual interests, but as a region. And that's when we said, why don't we just put together ASEAN Plus 6? Okay? And have take the whole rationale was to integrate the rules, to make the rules so you don't have what they call the spaghetti bowl of rules. You're bringing them all together, right? So it was overwhelming. That was the main thing driving us. So we then put together some ideas, and we go to the ministers, even our ministers, and say, here it is. Here's what we think it should be. And I remember very clearly the Singapore minister saying, what's all this? You're going on and on, plus 3, plus 4, but let's just say ASEAN plus whatever. Those willing and able, join this. So it can be plus 6, it can be plus 5, it doesn't really matter. So so that was when we said, okay, but we will work on the plus 6. At that time, there was agreement. All of us will be in the rule. Okay, plus 6. And that's how our set started. So the few, I was part of the group that drew up the guiding principles. How would we negotiate our set? So we formed those guiding principles. Everybody has a seat at the table. Everybody's voice is equal. Because you must understand, when you bring in the plus 6, you've got developed countries on one end, and then you allow Cambodia on the other end. So make sure. So very clear that this was going to be a very inclusive agreement. Because you must understand also, at that time, we were negotiating TPP. And TPP was different in that it was an agreement, and I keep saying this, an agreement among equals. To a large extent, it was driven by the US. Right? RCEP was an inclusive agreement. It was about ensuring that every member had a voice and every member's needs and interests were taken on board. And this, in that case, in this particular case, it was about making sure all of us took care of each other. I'm using very layman language. And now when we look at how things have progressed, it was the correct decision. It was a timely decision to take. And today, when you're talking about the community, yes, ASEAN Economic Community embraces all our other dialogue partners, so that it's a bigger, what started out as an ASEAN-centric community. Today, when you talk of the economic community, it's about integrating our dialogue partners as well. And I think that's really what matters for the region in today's context. I mean, it wasn't like we thought about it. It's a very, what can I say? It
was evolutionary.
Yeah, and it was a crazy coincidence, maybe, if you want to put it that way. Our intention was for the region, but because of how things have evolved, and today with the tariffs that we're having, the issue around the tariffs, and how the multilateral system is really being upended, what ASEAN has put together is so solid, and ASEAN must build up. You see, with all the noise, we're hearing so much noise around the tariffs, around the behavior of the US, it can distract from what we need to do. What do we need to focus on this year, really? in May, the leaders agreed to the ASEAN Community Vision 2045. Okay, that's for me. That's where the energy should be. So it was very, very interesting in this context. How much should you focus on managing the US versus what do we need to do as a region among ourselves, given what it is, So those are kinds of questions that we're going through right now. As a community, this is where the whole context of the community makes a lot more sense when you think about it today,
Well, one of the things that we're working on with Malaysia as ASEAN Chair this year, under our 18 Friday economic deliverables, is also the conclusion of the digital economy framework agreement, DEPA.
Yes.
DEPA. What would a successful conclusion of DEPA look like from a Malaysian perspective?
Yeah, I think for me, it has to really be an inclusive agreement. So, which means the needs of not just the big companies, the big tech companies, but also small companies and the community at larger. Because let me give you an example. We are very good at saying, you guys, in this kind of situation, you have to go online. E-commerce is the way to go. Correct. Yes. E-commerce is the way to go. Yes. But what if I'm in some rural part of Malaysia and I cannot, one, export because I don't know how to get online. Two, the infrastructure is not there for me to get online. So there's two, skills for me. Two, my infrastructure. Three, if I have both, but to export online to Indonesia, I have a different set of rules. To go to Cambodia, another set of rules. So all these things, so that makes it more complicated, not inclusive, right? So the impact, I'd like to see that. And I must say, I've skimmed through the agreement, and I think it's right on track, because in true ASEAN fashion, harmonization is tough, but at least you get us talking about it and seeing how to have a timeline to make sure that our rules, regulations, digital rules and regulations are aligned, so that ultimately it's easy for businesses to use the facilities. If you're talking about digital economy in its true sense, that all of us are able, our businesses, especially small and medium enterprises, the woman-led enterprise in some rural area can access this and take advantage of or benefit from the initiatives that we're putting in place for the digital economy. So what we are doing through DEFA, I think it's really important. It's overdue. When you think about it, it's overdue. COVID was in 2020, we are now in 2025. A lot of progress has been made because of COVID. So now it's time for us to really look at issues of cybersecurity, data privacy especially, combined with cybersecurity, looking at infrastructure, looking at infrastructure access go together, and preparing our people to the necessary skills, right? And it will be a catch-up thing if we're not doing it fast enough. Regulations are always one step behind, right? But so we need to be on top of things, especially today with AI. You cannot afford to take your time.
And on that note, that brings us to the end of the podcast.
So already,
actually, there were more questions that I would love to ask, but I really don't want to be taking more of your time. Thank you so much, Tan Sri Rebecca. This was very, very insightful, and to hear your personal experience as well is really such a treat.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the opportunity.
You've been listening to Malaysia's ASEAN Moment and ISIS Malaysia podcast. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, X, and LinkedIn at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, ISIS Malaysia, for more updates and insights into our chairmanship here.